Hey guys, what's good? So I wanted to talk about this story from Wired. 2024 was the year the bottom fell out of the games industry. Wanted to kind of read it for you guys and just react to it. So we'll go ahead and get into that. If you find this interesting, like, super appreciated. Anyways, for the people who make video games, 2024 was a year of holding on for dear life. At the annual Game Developers Conference in March, Survive Till 2025 was this year's incantation, which I actually think I'd heard that Jason Schreier did Adam Conover's podcast and he was talking to that. Now, I don't know what I would like to say I don't know what I think these people thought was going to change in 2025, but I do think to a certain extent that they probably believed that the election would have gone a different way, and these people are so one issued that I think they probably believe that all of their problems are directly related to a political movement and not that their problems stem into people who really don't care about politics, even though I think there's plenty of evidence to suggest that that's not the case. So I would like to say I think that the Survive Till 2025 was purely about non-political things, but I think that mantra was probably there for a reason because they thought things would probably go a different route and that a lot of their problems would probably be in the rear view because of that. Summoned to keep morale on pace. Others resorted to full-on screams as layoffs in the industry charted record highs and developers found themselves under attack online for conspiratorial nonsense. Well, first off, were there full-on screams at the conferences? Because if so, that seems a touch performative. I'm not sure where these full-on screams were observed at. But the other is, I love how dismissive concerns are when it comes to cultural progressivism in video games. Like how dismissive they are as a one issue and that they are kind of downplayed. And let me be clear, I don't think get woke, go broke was the sole purpose for the 2024 layoffs and the general downturn in the games industry. I think there are a lot of reasons, but to be so dismissive of one that clearly does seem to have some influence, it leads me to believe that 2025 will not be significantly better, if not worse. I don't know if we can still get worse, but I guess we're going to find out. In 2023, more than 10,000 developers had lost their jobs. One-third of game makers surveyed at the beginning of this year reported they had been affected by layoffs in some way. While there were wins for labor organizers at big studios like Activision Blizzard and collective action around fighting for protection from the encroachment of AI on employment, the industry's collective brain drain continued in 2024 as workers lost jobs en masse. 6 months in, this year's layoffs tally had surpassed that of 2023, according to Matthew Ball, an advisor and producer at the game and TV space. 2024's job loss will wind up being about 40% higher than the previous years. The explanation is a complex, wide-ranging for the same reason the layoffs are so deep and continuous and sit alongside many studio closures for even more canceled games, Paul says. I do think it's funny that they dismiss the whole cultural progressivism as being an issue within the game sales financially. But when it comes to actually explaining what the problem is, it's complex. We can't really explain it all. It's just too complex. There are too many facets. I think people are probably able to understand your explanation and are probably able to observe more than you give them credit for. So if you're going to say that something doesn't have any effect on game sales, then you do need to present some sort of an alternative explanation. And that does get touched on here, so I'm going to kind of go over the points there and give you that in a little bit later. The industry faltered. Games suffered high-profile releases like Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League were commercial failures. While there were many reasons for this, online right-wing groups reduced it to one single mantra: go woke, go broke. By their logic, if the game does poorly and has even a whiff of diversity, be it regarding gender, sexuality, or race, that disappointing performance is the fault of diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI. Now, I don't think it's a single issue at all. I think you can look at examples of cultural progressivism in games that were successful. We could look at Cyberpunk 2077. That touched on a lot of different things. You can look at Baldur's Gate 3. That touched on things. The difference between those two examples and what went on with a lot of these larger corporate owned, large corporate publisher owned studios is CD Projekt Red and Larian. They both, to a large degree, self-publish. I know, like, within certain regions, they do get help. Like, I think, like, GOG, I believe, helped publish some stuff that I read somewhere for Cyberpunk. Or not for Cyberpunk, but for CD Projekt Red. Either way, there are limits to... There are limits because the people who write the checks and the people who need the games to fail are within those studios, or games to succeed are within those studios. When you get these large corporate-owned developers, I don't think the development teams feel accountable because it's not their money that's on the line. I mean, eventually it will be, because obviously if you face layoffs, then, your money is on the line. But I think in the moment it's viewed as pure freedom to do whatever they want with, you look at a CG Project Red or a Larian. I do believe there's some need to make sure the game, fills the prime directive, so to speak. Games are a form of escapism. And when you're shoving real world stuff in there, you run the risk of removing that feeling of escapism. And once you do that, particularly in games where you're going to be asking for large sums of money, it's problematic. It is very problematic for a development studio to do that. And I think when you look at the few that have done that successfully, it's because they realize they can only do that with a little bit of caution, and so they don't go over the top with it. Anyways, let's go ahead and move on. Although there have been incredible games released this year, Balatros, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, Metaphor ReFantazio, Astrobot, Black Myth Wukong, they just couldn't distract from the troubles faced by the people making them. They couldn't make up for the fact that the meta-narrative of video games in 2024 was bleak. Outside of Balatro here, I'm pretty sure all of these games are made in the East or made by Eastern studios. I don't think that should go unnoticed, that when we look at the successes for 2024, virtually none of them came from the West. And I think it's important because as this article goes on, Western AAA right now is in a bad spot, and they want to lump the rest of the industry in with them. Even though there's really no evidence that anybody but them is feeling this downturn, or at least feeling it as significantly as they are. Ball says that the blame for all this can be pinned on a single thing like capitalism, mismanagement, COVID-19, or even interest rates. It also involves development costs, how studios are staffed, consumer spending habits, and game pricing. This storm is so brutal, he says, because it is all of these things at once, and none have really alleviated since the layoffs began. I don't understand capitalism. Like, how are you blaming capitalism for game sale? Like that one baffles me. I that one just feels like something somebody threw in because of their political leanings, because that's just a weird one. Mismanagement's definitely one. I will say that mismanagement across the board, not just at the developers, but at the publishers. COVID-19, I mean, I guess you could say the overhiring that happened during COVID-19 but I mean, that's largely alleviated at this point. So if you're going to say that COVID-19 overhiring was so dramatic that it's now making the layoffs worse, I could buy that explanation, but to then say that that's not been alleviated, I find that argument hard to believe. And interest rates, interest rates will be coming down this year. That's the one where I have no qualms with that explanation. It also involves development costs and how studios are staffed, consumer spending habits, and game pricing. Okay, here's the one where I think it's interesting. Development costs are largely a reason to keep justifying new hardware, even though it's obvious that we can't continue to visually and we can't continue to throw larger and larger and larger and larger development teams and development costs at these projects. Like, it's clear now that you've not just reached the point of diminishing returns in justifying new hardware, but you've reached the point of of damaging yourself to justify new hardware. And I do think the industry has to look at, have we reached the peak of what we can do reasonably within a sensible budget and expect to turn a profit? I feel like, in the last generation, the PS4, Xbox One generation, we had kind of reached the sweet spot of that, where teams were large enough that they could still make really great looking games, but development costs had not ballooned quite to the level that they are now. And I do think, obviously, there will be a PS6, there will be a sequel to Xbox, there will be, much hardware going forward. The problem is, at what point can we no longer utilize the hardware? At what point does increasing power in hardware mean that you won't have any games that actually utilize that power? Because I feel like that's coming in the very short term. And then when they talk about the development costs, when they talk about how studios should staff consumer spending habits and game pricing, I do say that one is probably the game pricing is probably a big issue, because we increased game prices, and some people might say that that's long overdue. Fair, but we increased game prices right as a global pandemic hit. Now, in the short term, it was fine because everybody was inside and you could justify the value better of entertainment that locked you to specifically being inside. So I do think in the short term, the game pricing thing wasn't an issue. But now that we've had significant inflation over the last few years and, wages have not rose to follow along that, a lot of people are now faced with the need to be more selective in their discretionary spending, particularly when it comes to entertainment. And, I know that they want to say that the cultural progressivism doesn't affect that, but if you have to be more selective about your purchases and you get these games that shove this stuff in that does, like I say, damage the Prime Directive and does pull you out of the escapist view of that entertainment, then there's going to be a lot of people who just decide not to invest their money in that. And they can keep saying this isn't a problem, but saying this isn't a problem ignores why people play games to begin with. Anyways, let's go on here. For indie developers, specifically, the threat to their existence has been substantial. Dozens of small studios shuttered in 2024, though it is difficult to get a full-blown picture of how many indie studios the industry lost. And they're more likely to shut down quietly and without much fanfare, or before many players even know they exist. I feel like this is Western AAA trying to spread it around. They can't really spread the problem around to the East as much because the East is doing significantly better than they are. So they take indies who don't largely have a voice of their own and kind of lump them in. We had plenty of indie successes in 2024. I mean, you could look at Palworld, which is literally, throw out the indie title, was just one of the biggest successes of 2024. You have games like Animal Well. There's a whole bunch. I'm not a big indie guy, but I know that, Balatro, there was quite a few indie successes in 2024. I feel like this is just spreading the blame around because you want to dictate what the problems are, and if you want to dictate what the problems are, you have to make sure that sectors of the industry that don't necessarily feel those issues as much still share in the overall downturn. With dwindling opportunities to get funding from investors and little cash to go around, developers sought alternative methods to fund their games. In the past year, some took bankrolling into their own hands. Among Us creator Innersloth launched an initiative to give fellow developers backing to finish projects. Others, like Tales of Kanzaro Zhao, developer Surgent Studios, made their plans public in early development in hopes of attracting investment, all while fending off racist attacks from the anti-DEI crowd, making the changes they're facing twofold. I will say that out of all of the games that sort of felt the brunt of the anti-DEI thing the most, Tales of Kanzaro Zhao was the one that didn't make a whole lot of sense to me, just because the game took an African setting, so its protagonist made sense to me. I know they had Sweet Baby Inc. involvement, and basically anything Sweet Baby Inc. touched was given a death sentence. But this is the one where, I look at it and I'm like, what exactly did Sweet Baby Inc. do to the game that wouldn't have had to have been done already? And maybe that's unfair on my part, but I just feel like that's probably the one that I look at where I'm like, maybe that one probably deserved a second look. I myself didn't play it, but I just think, I think it more suffered from the Sweet Baby Inc. death touch than it did for any of the actual content of the game itself. Even studios owned by tech juggernauts weren't immune to the industry's contraction. Microsoft shuttered Arcane Austin and Tango Gameworks. Sony shut down Firewalk. Later, shuttering wasn't wholly surprising. Its big 2024 release, Concord, was largely considered a flop. I love that they throw the largely in there, by the way. Like there was somebody who didn't consider it a flop. Like $400 million into a game that lasted like 10 days. Like there was somebody who goes, oh no, that's about what I would expect. Anyways, let's go ahead. But having to hit didn't give any studios safety net. Near universal acclaim for Tango's Hi-Fi Rush didn't stop Microsoft Axe. It did, though, give Tango just enough juice to get revived by a new buyer. I'm glad that Tango got revived by a new buyer, and I know that they've already announced a sequel to Hi-Fi Rush. I do hope that they would give The Evil Within another go, as long as they own the IP. I don't know if they own all the IPs that Tango has worked on. I would hope that they do. In other words, it's been a dismal year for morale. When developers gathered in Los Angeles in June of Summer Games Fest, developer New Blood Interactive bought a billboard solely to memorialize their fellow developers who lost their jobs. We love you, we miss you, we hate money. We hate money. You are in the business of making money. The idea that a developer who makes a product that they know will have to be purchased by the consumer to say we hate money, it's as if they're saying we should be able to make whatever we want and the money shouldn't matter. Saying we hate money is literally an indication of exactly where your brain is and the exact reason why you shouldn't be creating any sort of piece of entertainment that's going to need to be consumed financially. This year has been the 10th anniversary of Gamergate, the 2014 online hate movement that shaped the internet harassment tactics apparent today. But online conversations felt like a trip back in time. Conservative ideologues bemoaned the inclusion of characters who did not fit cookie-cutter images of white cis hetero men. First off, this whole article is goofy because nobody uses the word cis who isn't literally like 15% of Twitter. They complained that DEI was being forced upon them. It wasn't. So, again, this is why I don't have much hope for the games industry, why I don't have much hope for what's going on in Western AAA to be able to coexist, is because they refuse to acknowledge any problem. I myself can sit here on the other side viewing it as a problem and say, no, it's not the entire problem. But from their regard, for them to admit any of this has any validity is it's an existential threat to where they are right now. So I don't see the games industry getting better. I don't think I don't think a lot of these gamers who just want good games, that want games to be properties of escapism, we can't really coexist with Western AAA right now. Like, the reason that a lot of people are celebrating its demise is simply because they've looked at it as unsalvageable. And when you have complete just like fingers in your ear, la 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 la, I can't hear you response from the industry at large, I think they're right to feel that way, because it doesn't feel like they are at all concerned with serving the audience. And when they completely disregard real criticisms and real questions about the type of content they're producing, it just goes to show that they're not going to be able to just move on and be the same and continue while gamers are getting served what they want. In March, harassment towards a small consultancy company called Sweet Baby Inc. reached new heights as bad actors organized through Discords, Steam forums, and other online spaces, branding themselves as Gamergate 2.0. Online mobs harassed developers using tweets, DMs, YouTube videos, and Twitch streams. They targeted anyone with any connection to Sweet Baby and other consultancies. A fairly wide net of consultants are often brought in to advise accuracy, sensitivity, and more. Their mission was fighting against wokeification. The realities of the economic issues impacting games they love had no place in their tactics. The specter of diversity had more pull than analysis and experts. The realities of economic issues impacting the games they love had no place in their tactics. They don't love these games. The whole reason that the Gamergate 2.0 exists is because they hate these games. And here's the problem with all of this. If it's just the online Gamergate 2.0 crowd, they don't have the ability to make good games fail. I myself speaking here, even though I don't view myself as a Gamergate 2.0, if I have a problem with how a game decides to portray itself, I can't make that game fail or succeed. And I know that people will say, well, yeah, there's online discourse surrounding a game. Okay, fine, but what you have to then come to terms with is the online discourse is reaching a far larger audience than you've ever imagined. Because to me, who's on Twitter, maybe not daily, but multiple times a week, I see these people on there and I see the views on their tweets and things like that. I see the YouTube videos. I'm not saying there aren't communities around these games, but I don't believe these communities alone can tank these games like they're tanking. And if you don't want to come to terms with that, then you're basically just going to turn your failures into a complete cultural battle as opposed to looking at the actual macroeconomics of what you're trying to do and whether it's successful or not. You cannot simply put all of the blame for the current state of affairs on social media. I'm sorry, that math don't math. Anyways, games with black leads and characters were derided as forced female characters deemed unattractive or masculine were suffering from DEI chin. Dragon Age The Veilguard was criticized by far-right trolls for its customization options, which allow players to create with top surgery scars or players with a non-binary companion. After reviews were released, Conspirac launched into cliched paraphrases or other language as proof of the studio BioWare was instructing reviewers how to talk about their game. This feels much like pissing in somebody's hair and telling him it's raining. When the guy said he hoped to see return to form on Dragon Age Veilguard reviews, and literally every positive review threw return to form in there, and those exact words, I'm sorry, we're not that stupid. I mean, I'm kind of stupid. I'm not that stupid, okay? Even not yet released titles face bombardment. Compulsion's game South of Midnight, about a young black woman in the Deep South, drew ire and from anti-DEI crowds and platforms like X, where they photoshopped the heroine to make her look less repulsive and put forth conspiracy theories about Sweet Baby's influence on the game's development. We know that Sweet Baby is involved on South of Midnight. That's already public record. It's not, there's no conspiracy theory about it. It's literally public record from Sweet Baby themselves. So, I mean, okay, if you have a problem with that, but it's not a conspiracy. It's literally confirmed from the source. But pressures to remain apolitical, a curious agenda for an entertainment form that marries the artistic preferences of narratives and imaginary worlds with agency granted to the players who inhabit them, did not come from a vocal minority. Following the release of Black Myth Wukong, some streamers were given instructions to avoid talking about COVID-19 or feminist propaganda. The guidelines had the opposite effect, encouraging streamers to lead with the code words they've been barred from, a push against standards meant to actually censor. Who are these? I watched plenty of people streaming Black Myth Wukong. I didn't really see a whole lot of talking about this. This feels like revisionist history. I don't believe it had the opposite effect. I believe people actually didn't want to talk about this stuff to begin with. And literally because these people follow each other, and so if you're streaming it, you're generally going to be streaming to the 15 to 20% of Twitter that, that believes in this stuff. So maybe amongst that crowd, it had the opposite effect, but that crowd doesn't generate game sales. So I don't really think you could say at large that it had an opposite effect. And the whole idea that remaining apolitical. Okay. I want to get into this whole idea first off really quickly, that games that have themes built into them are somehow political. Let's say you have a religious cult in your game. That's completely acceptable. You're selling a world. It's living within the world. Now, there's a difference between having a religious cult that maybe represents Christianity and then sitting down and having a player break the fourth wall and say, I want to talk about to you about Jesus Christ for a minute. Because honestly, in Dragon Age Failguard, when the character sits down and just says, I'm non-binary, in a world where there was no criteria by which non-binary would make sense in that world, like, that's when you totally shatter the fourth wall. If you want to have themes in your game, that is fine. But sitting there, like, having a religious theme and then having a player want to talk to me about or having the character want to talk to me about Jesus, those are two different things. So saying that all games are political, no. Having themes doesn't make a game political. Looking ahead to 2025, Ball says he hears more pessimism generally, but it just sucks to contemplate, let alone predict. If there is one plus, he says, it's that there is a lot more hiring happening than is generally believed. Downside is it's not nearly as compensating overall, especially at indies. Again, like, these people keep talking about indies as if they have some metadata about what's going on in indie studios. Quit lumping indies in together, because all you might have is anecdotal evidence from the few indies that you do talk to. As 2024 comes to a close, the industry is operating from the outside with a business-as-usual mindset. In early December, developers gathered in Los Angeles to celebrate the Game Awards. On-stage host Jeff Keighley made a small speech amid game announcements, accolades, and performances from Snoop Dogg. The sad reality is that over the past few years, the gaming industry had suffered significant and unprecedented industry-wide layoffs, Keighley said. Those affects the games we get to play, and even more important, the games who make the games we love. I can't. My brain is not working, folks. Even more important, the people who make the games we love. We can debate and certainly disagree with the reasons why. Well, that's literally what I'm doing here. And as long as we completely disagree on the reasons why, the problems will probably continue, because you're not willing to come to terms with the reality of the environment, with the reality of the marketplace that you exist in. We can debate and certainly disagree on the reasons why, and honestly, as a show, we kind of struggle with how to address these topics in a constructive way. Fair enough, it's an award show. You probably shouldn't be dealing with those issues whatsoever. In fact, it would be great if we just didn't have these issues whatsoever, because there's no need for them. Keighley used a segment to introduce TGA's first Game Changer Award, a nod to an individual who has positively impacted the games industry. Then the show continued with headlines nominating announcements about major projects like The Witcher 4 and the next title from The Last of Us developer Naughty Dog. Okay, the Game Changer Award, which seemed very cringe and appeared to, at the time, be handed out to a guy who was an out-of-work developer that made an Excel spreadsheet. Turns out that out-of-work developer was not an out-of-work developer at all, but was actually a executive in charge of IP acquisition for Tencent, one of the largest gaming publishers, gaming owners at the time. That just sort of feels like the industry who laid off the developers. Like, he made a spreadsheet. Is the spreadsheet even getting anybody hired? Like, this just, to me, seems like a whole bunch of corporate goons who fired a whole bunch of developers they never should have hired in the first place, patting themselves on the back for making a spreadsheet. I'm sorry. Like, that's the reality of the situation. Amid all of this, the specter of AI, there is still insight on how much AI will continue to grow and how the future of the games future games might use it, but it's a rising concern as rank and file workers are laid off. No one knows when or if the industry will bounce back with sustainable jobs and compensation. Yes, there will be games to play. It's harder to say how many people will be able to make them. The Western AAA is going to get a lot worse before it gets better for Western AAA. There's no way around it, and this article itself just basically is an exhibit A as far as evidence as to why that's the case. If you don't want to, now I will say there are a lot of headwinds that they do address in this article that are legitimate. I do think interest rates to some degree are an issue. I do think, you can look at game sales and disposable income as opposed to wages. I do think there is some of that going on. But largely, I don't think. I think if anything, if you put a gun to my head and asked me to guess, will 2025 be worse for the gaming industry in layoffs wise? I would probably say yes. I look at companies like Ubisoft that are overstaffed to the moon relative to their actual worth as a company, and their possible acquisition by said Tencent and what that might mean as far as layoffs for that company. I think there's probably still a lot of overstaffing going on at Microsoft. I know they laid off a lot of people in 2024, but now they've had a year to come to terms with what their revenue looks like and what their profit margin looks like and what their growth potential looks like. And I do think that probably comes with some more layoffs, unfortunately. And then there's just the idea that you've had these huge flops. Concord's already through, that studio has already been shuttered. So, but you look at Suicide Squad, you look at, Dragon Age Veilguard, you look at Star Wars Outlaws, which I would be part of the Ubisoft, but there are plenty of high budget flops that have not yet had the massive layoffs that I think will be accompanied with those projects. So I do think there's probably some wide range layoffs going there. And hopefully, I don't know how we get to a better point, because we're still at a point where the Western AAA views itself as the resistance to the consumer. And I don't know how how you square that without more layoffs, and a lot of them. But anyways, guys, that's going to do it for this one. Appreciate you all, and we will catch you on the next one. Until then, guys, get awesome.